In this video, we're going to take a look at Robert Oster Honey Bee. So let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. Yellow? Golden brown? Either will do. This gives a great tone and even better shading all the time. I'm sure to seek out a bottle of this as soon as I can in my once-a-year ink buying. I really do want one of these. It just looks so different on the page, and I love it. In all of the versions, from dark to light, I can easily read it on the page, which means I can use it if I felt like it as I go to a class for note-taking, and it doesn't look like everything else that's done. And when I've had to handwrite things that get handed in, it stands out a little bit nicer, where it doesn't look like you just went and chose that pink glittery gel pen to write in some weird way, but it looks different enough that it asks questions. It gets people to wonder what you're writing with, and it opens up that fountain pen conversation that is so hard to have with people, to try and really penable them into a new dangerous hobby. Love this ink. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Noodler's Ahab. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. The fine nib has no feather and no spread, and very nice shading, and it's a very dry fine at that. And while it's a very dry fine, it gets its lightest tone that we're going to be able to see from this ink. And it's still easy to read. The medium is much darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, great shading. Absolutely love it. It just goes from this nice golden color to a dark enough yellow that I can easily see. Like the beginning of new, that N is much lighter than the rest of the word, but it's still easily there. You're not straining to be able to see it. The broad is much darker than everything else on the page, meaning you get much more of the dark tones, but not as much of the light. Still giving a lot of shading with no feather and no spread. Great performance. Looking at the back of the page, because it's a lighter ink, we get no ghosting and no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, it does look a little bit lighter in general than we saw on the Clairfontaine, which is a result of the tone of this paper and it not being coated the same. It has no feather and no spread. It still offers some shading, not nearly as much shading as we got with the Clairfontaine, but it is still definitely there, adding character to this. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, great shading. It is just that camouflage shading I love so much. It is entirely all over it. The broad is darker than the medium, and the shading here looks better than it did on the Clairfontaine. We get a lot of the mid and dark tones back and forth. Just look at the word obvious, or for, or one, or which, or choose any word, and you're going to see it going lighter to darker to lighter. Absolutely gorgeous to look at. Looking at the back of the page, we do get a little bit of ghosting and no bleed through, so absolutely great here. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. The fine nib has no feathering, no spread, much better shading than we saw with the Leuchtterm, and the color looks a little bit nicer. And it's strange because this is a very similar tone paper, though it's more absorbent. We wouldn't expect with that absorbency for it to be shading as well as it does, and that just speaks to how good this ink is. The medium, darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, really good shading. Absolutely love it. It's on a toned paper, it's bringing that old world feel that I personally feel about a lot of brown inks, but still keeping the yellowness about it. The broad is much darker than the medium. It still gives a lot of shading without making me take on feathering and spread to get it. So really doing well. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get almost no ghosting and absolutely no bleed through. Well done, Moleskine. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. While I generally like the composition notebooks, this paper really exposed a weakness of this ink. Looking at the fine nib, it is the lightest tone. Light enough that I would not want to take a whole page of writing with this, because I feel like it would be just a little bit more work on my eyes to read than I want. Now, it has no feathering or no spread, and it does offer little bits of shading, but it's shading from a very, very light to a very light tone. The medium, on the other hand, is quite a bit darker than the extra fine and falls right into a great zone here. We have no feather, no spread, very nice shading, not as much shading as on other papers, but this paper doesn't typically shade as much as them. The broad, darker than the medium. I would probably really prefer this, and just to get more used to using a broad nib if I was using this ink on this paper. No feather, no spread, great shading, looks so good. Your science notes are going to be fantastic. Looking at the back of the page, we have very minimal ghosting and no bleed through whatsoever. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Hor Dori. Here is Diatramentis Mahatma Gandhi Saffron. Here is Noodler's Golden Brown. Here is Pen BBS 184. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. With the fine nib, we get no feathering, no spread. We do get some shading that's going on, a very nice peppering of dark spots throughout it. It's performing well enough. I don't know how I feel about this tone here on this page. It gets a little dull, baby poop looking. Not quite baby poop, but a little baby poop looking. The medium is darker than the fine. It has no feather, no spread. It does offer some shading, but it offers a little bit more of the baby poop look. Where the broad has no feathering, but it does spread a little bit. It offers some shading. Still that baby poop look about it, which I'm not particularly happy with, so I wouldn't use this ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we had no bleed through that touched the page underneath. We did on the broad and the medium get some spots that are very deep into the page. All of them have ghosting, but I think the fine does the best in its performance. So if you really wanted to use it, fine is probably the way to go here. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a black ink by Monteverde Black Ash. Here is a blue ink by Califolio Ocanto. Here is a blue-black ink by Diatramentis Black Blue. Here is a green ink by Pilot, their Iroshizuku Shin Ryoku, or Forest Green. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. The fine has the tiniest bit of spread. It's not really that big a deal, but it is a little wider than it was on the other writing. It has no feathering. It does offer a couple moments, maybe, of shading. Not a fan of this particular tone as it's coming out. It just looks a little bit off here, and not quite a honey tone like we would really think. I have honey every day, and it doesn't look like this. The medium is darker than the fine with tiny feathers. Not a big deal, but bees don't have feathers, and this does. And they're all over and not the end of the world. It does spread some, not the end of the world with using this cheap paper either, just write a little bit larger and a little faster. It does give a little bit of tone variation at the although where I backed up over it to fix my own spelling, but we're going to see that in a moment. The broad is darker than the medium with feathering, with spread. Both of would be expected. Not much for shading. There's a couple darker spots, and that's about it. On the other side, where although occurred, where I backed up to fix my own writing, it did bleed through and touch the page underneath, as it did in one other spot. Now, the writing itself, it gets very deep into the paper, more about that paper than it is about the ink. A lot of ghosting. Generally, I don't see this bleed through as being a problem. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? Yes, please. Dealer's choice. Do it over. Yes, please. Dealer's choice. It always looks so good as long as you're not using the cheaper paper. But if I had to choose, I would go for a a medium flowing medium nib or a wet stub. The wet stub puts down a very nice amount of that darker tone shading very well. I think the medium, as it's in general throughout all of its writing, looks really good. I think the shading looks a bit nicer from the wet stub. So if you're a gusher of a pen user and you like stubs, go for this. Or if you're a standard medium flow, medium nib, rock on, because you're going to love this ink. I do. I hope you got something out of this video, and if it leads to you wanting to try this ink, when you purchase it, let the retailer know where you heard about it, whether it's me or any other channel. Thanks for watching.